In the winter of 1871, a baby was born on the Kansas prairie, who never drew a single breath. The doctor pronounced her dead. The midwife prepared her for burial. But when her mother refused to let go, something impossible happened. The child's eyes opened, her fingers moved, and though her chest never rose or fell, though no air ever passed through her lips, she lived. For 23 years, she grew, she aged, she walked among the living, and everyone who knew her secret died in ways that couldn't be explained. The Hutchins family farm sat 12 miles outside of Lawrence, Kansas, where the wind cut across the plains like a blade and winter turned the earth to iron. Margaret Hutchins went into labor on December 3, 1871, during a blizzard that buried the roads and trapped her family inside their two-room house. Her husband Samuel rode through the storm to fetch Dr. Abernathy, but the winds were so fierce it took him 4 hours to travel what should have been 40 minutes. By the time they returned, Margaret had been in labor for nearly 9 hours. Her sister-in-law Clara had been doing what she could, boiling water and tearing sheets, but they both knew something was wrong. The baby wasn't moving the way it should. The labor was too quiet, too still. When the child finally came, she was blue. Her lips were dark purple, her skin mottled and cold. Dr. Abernathy worked on her for 15 minutes, trying everything he knew. He cleared her airways. He rubbed her chest. He held her upside down and patted her back. Nothing worked. The baby never cried, never gasped, never made a sound. "I'm sorry," he said finally, wrapping the tiny body in a blanket. "She was born sleeping. Sometimes the Lord calls them home before they ever arrive." Margaret wouldn't accept it. She took the baby from the doctor's hands and held her against her chest, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers and promises into the silent room. Samuel tried to take the child, tried to convince his wife to let go, but Margaret screamed at him to get away. Clara stood in the corner, crying quietly, and Dr. Abernathy gathered his things with shaking hands. "I'll return in the morning," he said, "to help with arrangements." But morning brought something no one expected. When Clara came to check on Margaret just after dawn, she found her sister-in-law asleep in the rocking chair with the baby still clutched to her chest. The child's eyes were open, not the cloudy, vacant eyes of death, but clear and focused, staring up at Margaret's face with what looked like recognition. Clara's scream woke the entire house. Dr. Abernathy returned within the hour, despite the snow still falling thick outside. He examined the baby with trembling hands, checking her pulse, her temperature, listening to her chest with his stethoscope. He spent 20 minutes in that examination, growing more confused and disturbed with each passing moment. "Her heart is beating," he said finally. "Slow but steady. Her body is warm. She responds to stimuli. But she isn't breathing. Her lungs aren't moving at all." "That's impossible," Samuel said. "If she's not breathing, she's not alive." "I know what I'm seeing," Dr. Abernathy replied, "and I can't explain it." They named her Josephine. For the first few weeks, the family watched her constantly, expecting her to stop moving at any moment, expecting death to finally claim what it had missed. But Josephine continued to exist in her impossible state. Her eyes tracked movement. Her fingers grasped at objects. She grew hungry and fed from Margaret's breast like any normal infant. The only difference was the silence. No crying, no coughing, no breathing. Word spread quickly through Lawrence. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, a baby who lived without breath was the kind of story that traveled fast. Some people called it a miracle. Others called it something darker. The local priest, Father Donnelly, came to the farm 3 times in the first month, insisting he needed to examine the child to determine if she was blessed or cursed. Margaret refused to let him near Josephine. "She's my daughter," Margaret said, "and she's perfect." But as the months passed, people started to notice other things that were harder to dismiss. The Hutchins family had 3 milk cows. Within 6 months of Josephine's birth, all 3 animals died. Not from disease or injury, but from what the veterinarian called exhaustion, as if something had drained the life from them slowly over time. The chickens stopped laying eggs. The crops that Samuel planted that spring barely grew, producing maybe a third of their normal yield despite good weather and careful tending. And there were the visitors. Anyone who spent too much time around Josephine started feeling tired. Dr. Abernathy, who had examined her regularly in those first few months, developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Clara, who had helped care for the baby, began experiencing fainting spells. Even Samuel, who loved his daughter despite the strangeness surrounding her, started looking older than his 31 years, his hair turning gray at the temples, his face developing deep lines. The only person who seemed unaffected was Margaret. She stayed close to Josephine constantly, rarely letting anyone else hold her, and her health remained perfect. Some people whispered that she had made a deal, that she had traded something for her daughter's impossible life. No one said these things to her face. By Josephine's first birthday, most of the community had stopped visiting the Hutchins farm. The family had become isolated, spoken about in whispers and worried glances. Samuel still went into town for supplies, but people served him quickly and sent him on his way. Children were warned not to go near the Hutchins property. Stories spread about lights seen in the windows at odd hours, about strange sounds carrying across the fields at night. Make sure you're paying attention to what happened next, because this is where the deaths began. Dr. Abernathy was the first. He died in his sleep 3 days after Josephine's first birthday, his body found by his housekeeper. The undertaker said his heart had simply stopped, which wasn't unusual for a man of 53. But those who had watched him examine that breathless baby remembered how he'd aged in those months, how the light had seemed to drain from him visit by visit. Clara was next. She collapsed while hanging laundry 6 weeks later. Samuel found her in the yard, her skin cold despite the summer heat, her eyes open and empty. The doctor who examined her body said it looked like her heart had given out. But Clara was only 27 years old and had been healthy all her life. Father Donnelly, who had tried repeatedly to see Josephine, fell ill with a fever that October. He died 3 days later, speaking in confused sentences about shadows and debts unpaid. 3 deaths in less than a year, all connected to the same family, all people who had been close to that strange, silent child. The town began to talk openly now, about witchcraft, about curses, about things that shouldn't exist but somehow did. A group of men came to the Hutchins farm on a cold night in November. They carried torches and guns and righteous anger. Samuel met them at the door with his own rifle, but there were 12 of them and only one of him. "Hand over the child," their leader said. A man named Dutch Werner, who owned the hardware store in town. "She's not natural. She's bringing death to this community." "She's just a baby," Samuel said. "She hasn't hurt anyone." "3 people are dead. Your crops are dying. Your animals are dead. That thing in your house is cursed, and you know it." Margaret appeared behind Samuel, holding Josephine wrapped in blankets. The baby was awake, her dark eyes scanning the crowd of men with their flickering torches. She was bigger now, nearly a year old, but still eerily silent. No babbling, no sounds of any kind, just those watchful eyes and that chest that never moved. "You'll have to kill us both," Margaret said quietly, "because I'll never let you take her." The standoff lasted nearly an hour. Voices were raised. Threats were made. Samuel never lowered his rifle. Finally, as midnight approached, the men retreated. But Dutch Werner turned back at the property line and pointed at the house. "Mark my words, Samuel Hutchins. That thing will be the death of you all." He was wrong. It would be the death of him. Dutch Werner's store burned down 3 weeks later. The fire started in the middle of the night, spreading so quickly that Dutch barely escaped with his life. He suffered burns over 40% of his body and died 2 days later from infection. The marshal investigated but found no clear cause for the fire. It had started in the center of the store, nowhere near the stove or any lamps. The night Dutch Werner died, witnesses reported seeing a small figure standing across the street from the burning building. A child's silhouette, perfectly still, watching the flames. After that, people stopped coming near the Hutchins farm entirely. The family might as well have been quarantined. Samuel had to travel to the next town over to buy supplies. No one would trade with him. No one would speak to him. The Hutchins family had become ghosts, haunting the edges of Lawrence society. But Josephine kept growing. By age 3, she looked like any other toddler. She walked. She learned to feed herself. She played with the rag dolls Margaret made her. The only differences were the silence and the stillness of her chest, and the way Samuel and Margaret were aging. Samuel's hair had gone completely gray. Margaret had developed a persistent tremor in her hands. They looked like people in their 50s, though Samuel was only 34 and Margaret 31. Something was taking from them, something they were willing to give. By age 7, Josephine had learned to write. She couldn't speak, couldn't make any sounds at all without breath to carry them. But she could communicate through letters scratched in the dirt or charcoal on scraps of wood. Her first written words were simple. "I am sorry." Margaret cried when she read them. "You have nothing to be sorry for, sweet girl." Nothing at all. But Josephine wrote again, her small hand careful and deliberate. "I know what I am. I know what I take." The truth was impossible to deny anymore. Josephine wasn't just alive without breathing. She was sustaining herself on something else. Life force, vitality, the essence of whatever made things grow and thrive. She pulled it from the land around her, from the animals near her, from the people who stayed too close for too long. The only ones she couldn't seem to drain completely were Samuel and Margaret, perhaps because they were her parents, perhaps because they had given her permission from the beginning, holding her close, refusing to let her die. Whatever the reason, they aged and weakened. But they lived. They wouldn't live much longer. By the time Josephine turned 10, Samuel could barely work the farm anymore. His hands shook too badly to hold tools steady. His heart raced at the slightest exertion. Margaret's hair had gone white. She had trouble remembering things, losing herself mid-conversation or forgetting what day it was. But they still loved their daughter. They still protected her from a world that wanted her dead. Josephine had grown into a strange, solemn child. She spent most of her time alone, reading books that Samuel brought from town, writing long letters to her parents that expressed thoughts and feelings she couldn't voice. She understood what she was. She understood the cost her existence demanded, and she understood that her parents were dying to keep her alive. One morning when she was 11, Josephine walked to the well behind the house and stared down into the darkness. Her reflection looked back at her from the water below, pale and still. She stayed there for hours, unmoving, while Margaret called for her from the house. That night, she wrote her longest letter yet. Mother, Father, I have lived 11 years that I should not have had. 11 years of your lives that I have stolen. I understand now why the people in town fear me, why they wanted to burn me. I am not natural. I am not right. I love you both more than I can write in all the words I know, but I cannot keep taking from you. I will not watch you die for me. She left the letter on the kitchen table and walked out into the night. Samuel found her at dawn, standing in the middle of the wheat field. The crops around her had withered in a perfect circle, 20 feet in every direction, the stalks brown and dead. Josephine stood at the center, her head bowed, her hands at her sides. He approached slowly, his heart hammering in his weak chest. "Josie," he said softly, "come back to the house." She turned to look at him, and Samuel saw tears streaming down her face. Silent tears, falling without the hitching breaths of sobs, without the sounds of crying, just water running down her cheeks. She pointed to the dead crops, then she pointed to him. then to herself. "I know," Samuel said. "I've always known." He held out his hand, and after a long moment, Josephine took it. Together they walked back to the house, leaving the circle of dead wheat behind them. But Samuel and Margaret were living on borrowed time. Margaret died on Josephine's 12th birthday. She simply didn't wake up one morning, her heart having finally given everything it had to give. Samuel buried her on the hill behind the house, marking her grave with a cross made from fence posts. Josephine stood beside him throughout the service, her hand in his, both of them silent. Samuel lasted another year. 13 years of sustaining a child who shouldn't exist had taken everything from him. By the end, he could barely leave his bed. Josephine cared for him as best she could, bringing him water, keeping him warm, writing him letters that said all the things she wished she could speak aloud. On his last day, Samuel called Josephine to his bedside. "I don't regret it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not a single day. You were worth it, Josie. You were worth everything." Josephine wrote quickly, her hand shaking. "I love you." "I know," Samuel said, smiling. "I've always known." He died that afternoon with Josephine holding his hand, his last breath leaving him as peacefully as his daughter's first breath never came. Josephine buried him next to Margaret on the hill. Then she stood alone in the empty farmhouse and considered her options. She was 13 years old. She had no family, no friends, no one in the world who would take her in. The farm was slowly dying, unable to sustain life in her presence. Eventually, someone from town would come to claim the property, and they would find her here. They would kill her. She knew that, with absolute certainty. So she left. The Hutchins farm stood empty for 3 years. The house fell into disrepair. The fields returned to wild grass. People said the property was cursed and refused to buy it. Eventually, it was claimed by the county for unpaid taxes and left to rot. But stories started spreading through Kansas. Stories of a silent girl who appeared in different towns, never staying long, never speaking. A girl who looked about 16, with dark hair and darker eyes, who would take work doing laundry or mending or cleaning. She was a good worker, people said, quiet, kept to herself. But after a few weeks, things would start to go wrong. Crops would fail, animals would sicken, people would start feeling tired all the time. And if anyone got too curious about the girl, if anyone started asking too many questions, they would find themselves aging rapidly, their health failing, their strength leaving them. The girl would disappear before anyone could confront her. She would move to the next town, the next county, always running, always alone. By 1891, witnesses reported seeing her in Missouri. By 1895, she had been spotted in Arkansas. By 1899, there were reports from as far away as Louisiana. Always the same description. A young woman who never spoke, who never seemed to breathe, who brought misfortune to everyone around her. She was 17 years old for 23 years. The last confirmed sighting of Josephine Hutchins was in 1894, in a small town in Oklahoma Territory. A woman named Sarah Bell, who ran a boarding house, took in a quiet girl who said she needed work. Sarah couldn't remember later if the girl had actually said anything, or if she had just understood somehow. The girl stayed for 6 weeks. She cleaned rooms, did laundry, helped with cooking. She was the perfect tenant, Sarah said later. Polite, clean, hard-working. But Sarah started having dreams. Dreams about a baby who wouldn't die, about parents aging to dust, about a debt that could never be repaid. She would wake in the middle of the night and find the girl standing in the hallway, perfectly still, staring at nothing. On the final night, Sarah woke to find the girl sitting at the foot of her bed. The moonlight came through the window, illuminating her face. She looked young, maybe 17 or 18, but her eyes looked ancient. The girl reached out and touched Sarah's hand. Just a brief touch, fingers to fingers. Sarah felt something pass between them, something cold and heavy and inevitable. Then the girl stood up and walked out of the room. Sarah heard the front door open and close. When she checked in the morning, the girl's room was empty. She had taken nothing with her, left nothing behind except a smell like old earth and a coldness in the air that took 3 days to fade. Sarah Bell died 2 weeks later. The doctor said her heart gave out, which was unusual for a woman of 35, but not impossible. After that, the sightings stopped. Or maybe people just stopped reporting them. Maybe Josephine Hutchins found a way to exist without taking so much from those around her. Maybe she learned to control what she was. Or maybe she finally found a way to die properly, to let go of the life she should never have had. The records don't say. History has no answers for things that shouldn't exist. But there are still stories. Even now, more than a century later, there are stories about a woman who appears in small towns across the Midwest. A woman who looks young but has old eyes. A woman who never speaks, never breathes, never stays long enough for anyone to know her name. She takes work where she can find it, cleaning houses, tending gardens, helping with harvests. She's always polite, always quiet. People describe her as a good worker, someone reliable. But if you watch closely, you'll notice she never breathes. Her chest never rises or falls. And if she stays too long in one place, things start to wither. Plants die. Animals sicken. People grow tired for no reason they can name. And if you look into her eyes, if you get close enough to really see her, you'll recognize something there. Something desperate and hungry and impossible to satisfy. The look of someone who has been alive for too long, who knows the cost of every day, who can't stop taking even though she wants to. The look of a baby who never breathed but somehow never died. People who claim to have seen her say she leaves behind one thing, always the same thing, found scratched in the dirt outside houses where she stayed, or written in dust on windowsills, or traced in frost on winter mornings. Just 2 words. I'm sorry. In 1923, a researcher named Thomas Whitmore investigated the Josephine Hutchins case for a book he was writing about Midwestern folklore. He traveled to Lawrence, Kansas, and interviewed the few remaining people who remembered the Hutchins family. Most were elderly by then. Their memories faded, but they all told similar stories. A baby born dead who somehow lived. Parents who aged too fast. Deaths that couldn't be explained. Whitmore visited the old Hutchins farm, which had been abandoned for more than 30 years by that point. The house had partially collapsed. The fields were overgrown. The graves on the hill were weathered and crooked. He spent 3 days there, taking photographs and notes, documenting everything he could find. On the 3rd night, he claimed he saw a figure standing in the doorway of the ruined house. A woman, he said, young-looking with long dark hair. She stood perfectly still watching him. Whitmore called out to her, but she didn't respond. He started walking toward the house, and the figure disappeared into the shadows. He searched the entire property, but found no one. When he developed his photographs back home, one of them showed something strange. In the background of a shot he'd taken of the graves, there was a blur, a shape that might have been a person standing on the hill, watching. The exposure was wrong, the image unclear, but Whitmore swore it was the same figure he'd seen. He included the story in his book, published in 1925. Critics dismissed it as folklore, a tall tale blown out of proportion over decades. But Whitmore stood by his account until his death in 1947. His widow, when cleaning out his study, found a journal he'd kept. The last entry, written just days before his death, contained only one sentence. She came back last night. She hasn't aged at all. The truth about Josephine Hutchins died with the people who knew her. Whether she was a miracle or a curse, whether she learned to control her nature or was controlled by it, whether she found peace or is still wandering somewhere in America's small towns, these questions have no answers. But the story persists, passed down through generations, embellished, changed, adapted. Like all good ghost stories, It contains a kernel of something people recognize. Fear of the unnatural. Fear of what shouldn't exist, but does. Fear of the cost of keeping something alive that should have died. And maybe fear that somewhere out there, in a boarding house or a farm or a small town where everyone knows everyone, there's a woman who never speaks, who never breathes, who works quietly and leaves before anyone can ask too many questions. A woman with a debt she can never repay, taking just enough to survive another day, another month, another year. The Hutchins farmhouse finally collapsed completely in 1954, the last walls falling during a spring storm. The county cleared the land and sold it for development. Houses were built there in the 1960s. Normal houses, full of normal families living normal lives. But the residents of those houses report strange things. Pets that won't go into certain rooms. Gardens that won't grow in specific spots. A feeling of being watched when standing in the backyard, especially near the hill where 2 weathered crosses used to mark forgotten graves. And sometimes, on quiet nights, people claim to see a figure standing in the old wheat field. A woman, they say, young-looking, just standing there, perfectly still, her chest never rising or falling, just watching.